Welcome to another episode of the Quilty Life with Jenn George Burt. Today we're going to be talking about something called squares in squares. Well, I've printed out some examples here for us to look at so we can get an idea of what I'm talking about. This one here, this is what is usually referred to as a square in a square block. It also comes up as being a diamond in a square and also an economy block. So this block has a lot of different names, but it's a very classic block. But as you can see, it's just a square and then it's got triangles on the sides that turn it into a square within a square. This is just one step further. It takes this and then you add another layer on, and then this one is just the same thing, but with one more added onto it. So these are just building on each other. This is another common example that people call square in a square. So this one is done sort of in a log cabin-y sort of way. So you start with this one and then you sew this on and then that and then that and then that. And this one actually is done with a partial seam. We're not going to do anything that fancy today, but we can get this look. This is another common example of square in a square. And this is like layers of squares and squares. And this is done sort of log cabin style, right? So you have a square and then you sew these sides on and then that, and then these, and then that, and so on. And you could build this out very large if you wanted to. These last two, this one is like a bow tie is the common name of this particular layout, but these are the same thing. If you look at it, it's just the way the colors are placed. This one has a square in the middle with 4 colors on the outside. This one has a square in the middle where these two are the same color and these are like a background color. So we can do all of these things in a very improv way and not have to worry about what you would have to worry about if you wanted to make these perfectly perfect. We just want the look and feel of square in a square. So let's work on this one first, which is just a square with triangles on the outside of it. So I've got my lovely scrap bin. I've got all my scraps left over from our earlier episode. Let's see what we can do with smaller bits before we start digging into the larger ones. Let's do this as our square in the middle. So we're going to call that our square. And then we need some triangles around the outside. So generally what I'll do is I'll sort of audition. I say, okay, well that's going to be, it needs to be that long, you know, and then we remember we're going to lose 1/4 inch. So I'm going to just slide it down there. So now I know basically what size all of my triangles need to be. So then I could go around. Usually what I do is just something along these lines and just say, okay, well that one looks good. And this looks pretty good. And let's pick one more. Yeah, let's go right here in that corner. So as you can see, I am not being overly fussy with what size they are. I just need them to be generally similarly sized. So I'm just going to sew on 2 of them on opposite sides first because that makes it easy. So I'm going to put these 2 on. I'm going to sew 1/4 inch from each side. And now I'm just going to press these out. So as usual, I am going to finger press this first, just to make sure it's nice. And then I use my handy dandy little seam roller. This is by Clover. Mine is purple. They are usually blue. And then I'm going to take it over to my ironing board and iron it. So now it's nice and flat and I need to add these 2 on this side. So I'm going to come in here, and you could do that with a ruler. You can always do it with a ruler. There are no rules for or against rulers when it comes to improv. So then I'm going to look at this and I say, okay, well that looks pretty good. How about if I do it that way? So I'm going to put that side on there, and I'm going to put this side on here, and then sew 1/4 inch down each side. And there we go. So now what we need to do is square things up a bit. Now, if you don't care what size the final thing is going to end up, you can just come in here and cut the sides off. You could also, if you had a square that was around the same size that you wanted it to be, you could come in here and say, all right, if I cut here and here, let's do it that way, just so we can see how it goes. So I'm going to cut here, and I'm going to cut here, all right, and then take these out of the way. Now, I missed that little jib, didn't I? Spin this around, And now I can line up with my 4" and 4" along here and here, and then cut those off. And now we've got a 4" by 4" square in a square. Now, one thing to keep in mind is whenever you sew this to something else, you are going to lose 1/4 inch. So on this side, we are cutting it real close. It is right on the line of 1/4 inch. So you might knock off one of these points. These two are larger, so you don't really have to worry about those. But if you want to make sure that you're not losing any of your points on your inside square, you do need to keep that 1/4 inch seam allowance in mind. So as you can see, we have now made this. Now let's add on some extra corners. Let's turn it like this. So this will now become this, and we're going to add extra triangles on to make it a little bigger. This time we are going to come up with our triangles in a slightly different way than we did last time. This time I'm going to start out with a large square. I'm going to cut this square, or it's kind of rectangle to be honest, in half that way, and then I'm going to cut each of them in half like this. So now I have 4 triangles. We're going to do exactly the same thing that we did last time. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these 2 on, fold them back, put those 2 on, and fold them back just like I did last time. And there we go. Now we've got a square in a square in a square. And just so you know, after I pressed this, I went in and set my big tailor's clapper on top of it, over on the ironing board, of course. And I just let it sit there for about 30 seconds. That makes sure it gets nice and flat, and which is, you know, that's really important when you're doing improv. You don't want to end up with things that are super lumpy. All right, so we've got this nice and flat, and you notice, just as I predicted, we did lose some of our little points right here, but this is improv and I like things wonky, so this does not bother me at all. If that did bother you, remember, just pay attention to that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you won't lose those points right there. In this case, I am not going to use a square this time. I'm going to do it much more freewheeling. I'm actually not even going to use a ruler, and I'm just going to come in here and trim these sides down like this. And now it is nice. And this time you can see my triangles were quite big, and I'm not even close. There's no danger that I'm going to lose these points here this time. All right, so there we go. We have now made this one. Now, obviously, if we do like this, this can become this part, and then we can add more triangles on. So we're actually going to do that, and I'm going to show you yet one more way to cut your triangles to get these. Okay, this time the triangles have to be quite big, right? Just to get a big enough square out here. So I am going to dig into my bigger stash over here to get that. Now I'm going to look at this and say, all right, well, I need it to be around that size. So if I think about that, then I say, okay, well, if I had a square of fabric about this big, and then I cut that in half, then I'm going to have triangles that are the right size. Super. But notice, I did not leave myself enough to cut another one of these. So I can make a decision here. I could say, well, I could definitely get one out of this and then have one oddball, or I could make these 2 a little bit smaller, or I could go and put in a different color. So that way I could have, you know, 2 hot pink or darker pinks on this side, and then maybe a lighter pink on this side. And I think that's what I'll actually do this time. Okay, so here's what we're going to go with. So now we have a square and a square and a square in a square. And we could come in here and clean these up. We could use a big ruler, get this to be exactly the size that we want it to be. Or we could even add some more triangles on and keep going. To recap, we did this, and then we made it into that, and then we made it into that. You could stop at any point. Any of those are called square in square, but we just kept on going. All right, next up, we are going to go for the middle row here. We are going to start out doing something that looks similar to this. We are just going to put a little square here, and then we're going to put a big fat border around it. So let's get over here into the scraps and find ourselves a middle that we like. Let's use this. We can have sort of a rainbow in the middle. So there's our first square in the middle, and then we think about what we're going to put around the outsides. And I think I'm going to put 4 different ones around the outside is how I'm going to build this. So I'm going to cut that. And then let's see, I've got this nice blue. That one will be nice. So I'll just keep that one that length for now. No need to trim it down too soon. And let's see, what else do we have? This one is quite nice. And I will also leave this one pretty big. And then how about this orange here? So notice what I did when I picked these. When I was looking at the lengths, I needed to make sure that this was going to cover that whole length. And then I have to think, well, if I sew that on, now I've got a piece that's that big. So this piece needs to be at least that long, minus the 1/4 inch seam allowance, but we're just eyeballing stuff. Then we got the same sort of thing here. So we need to make sure that's wide enough. This way doesn't matter as much. This is the part that matters. And then this, I'm going to go here. All right, so I'm going to go and sew this onto that. And now I have this. So I'm going to cut this off so it's nice and even. And then let's see, I don't need all of this. I'm going to cut a little bit of it off just so I don't have too much to deal with. And I'm going to sew this onto this. And I bet you can guess what's going to come next. We're going to sew this on here. So let's straighten that edge up. And we see we have a good bit extra here. So let's cut that off. Now we're going to sew this onto that. All right, and now we have this, and we need to sew the orange on, and there we go. So my initial thought was I was going to keep all of these pretty skinny around here, and I was thinking I was going to come in here and cut these smaller, but I actually like the look of this where the square is sort of up here in the corner, so I'm going to keep it. So I'm going to keep as much of this as I can. I am just going to come in here this, and obviously you could do this with more precision or getting it to be a particular size if that's what you were after, but we are not into a particular size and we don't need it to be perfectly square, so there it is. So as you can see, this one is really similar. It's got a similar look and feel to this, but it's way more wonky, it's way more improv, and it's slightly different because we didn't worry about any sort of partial seams or anything crazy like that. Next up, we're going to go for one like this. We're going to go with a square and a square and a square. We're going to go only 2 layers out, not 3 layers out like this one here. So as usual, we need a center, and let's start kind of small so our block doesn't get out of hand. Let's look at, I actually have a piece of this left over from before. Do we have any more small pieces of that? Indeed we do. We can cut these in half. We can do this one here, put this one here, and then we need a sort of long one along that side. Yes, but we will cut it in half because we don't need it to be so fat. So that's what we'll do. So I'm going to sew these on in the clockwise order like I did with the last block. The other option that you have is you could sew one and then these 2 on. It doesn't really matter. Whatever makes sense with the pieces that you cut. In this case, it makes the most sense to do it that way. So I've got these other 3 sides on here, and as you've seen in the previous blocks that I've been doing, I was always cutting it off before I put the piece on. I just wanted to remind you that you don't have to do that. You don't have to come in here first. If this is a straight side like this one is, I can just lay this on here, come in, sew 1/4 inch away, and then come back and cut the extra off. So there we go. I've sewn my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and now I'm going to come in and trim off the extra. And now I press. Okay, so we have made a frame around our inside square, and I am going to, in this case, go ahead and square all of this up so I don't have to think about it later. And also so I have a general idea of how big this is. So now we're going to put another frame around it. I think we'll go with this color of blue. I like that. So in this case, I think I'm going to cut them about that wide, and I'm going to do one on the top and the bottom first, and then I'll come back in and put these on the side, but I'm going to sew these first and then I will cut the other 2 pieces. And notice after I sewed this actually, the piece underneath they weren't the same straightness. This one kind of went in, this one kind of went out. So before I press the seam allowance open, I am going to take that off so I don't get any bad shadowing, and I don't want it to show through my finished quilt. Okay, and now I'm going to put on other pieces. So I like about like that, and another about the same length. So we'll go with that. And there we go. We've added another frame onto it. So I'm going to go in here and just cut those edges off. Now we have a square in a square in a square. So as you can see, it's very similar to this. We stopped right here. We didn't put this last bit on. You could if you wanted to. It is totally up to you. All right, next up, we are going to go for bottom row. We are going to do this one. I'm only going to show you this one because once you see that one, you'll understand how to do that one. Now, what you want to pay attention to, again, like I pointed out before, this is like the shape of a bow tie, and this block is usually called a bow tie block. It's got a square in the middle, and then there's these pieces that are the same color, and then these are a different color. The difference in this one, of course, is that there's 4 different colors around the outside. So let's do this with some orange, an orange bow tie. So this square and these 2 pieces right here are going to be this orange, and then let's make the background this lighter orange. So it'll be a dark orange on a light orange. And I'm just going to set our little diagram up here so we remember what we're shooting for, since this one is not as obvious or as familiar maybe as the other ones. So I am first going to cut 2 squares that are approximately the same size. And now what I'm going to do is I am going to cut each of these into quadrants like that. Okay, so let's push these over here to the side. Now, what I want you to notice is that these 2 here are these 2, and these 2 are extra for the moment. We'll set them here, and then this is going to go here, and this is going to go here. So maybe we get one that's a little bit bigger. The way I had cut those, this one was a little bit on the small side. Now, how am I going to get that square in there? Well, here's the trick. So I'm going to pile up all of these triangles, and I'm not caring about really what's going on back here. I just want all of their points to pretty much line up. And maybe I don't love that triangle as much as I thought I did. Maybe this one's better. Yeah, because look, those points all match up a lot better. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, and I'm actually going to use a ruler. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to cut an inch off of here. Now you can cut as much off or as little off as you want, obviously, but that's what I decided to do. But I'm cutting them all off at the same time. Now let's put them all back where they belong. Now I'm going to come in here and sew on a little tip onto each of these triangles in the color that I want the middle square to be, which in this case is this. So I'm going to come up in here and I'm going to say, okay, I want it to be a triangle about that big. That seems like it'll be about right. See, so I'm testing it to make sure when I flip in 1/4 of an inch, when I flip that back out, yeah, I don't lose too much. So that's about the size that I want. So then I'm just going to come over here. I'm going to cut another one of these around that size. And then I need 2 more. And I'm just going to turn this around like this because I can get it out of here. And then that one, I'll set that aside because I'll just use this. And this one looks like it's probably closer to the right size. All right, now I have 4 little triangles that are the right size. And I'm going to sew one of them onto each of these. And there we go. And you're thinking, Jen, now why did you go and cut that orange off and then sew the exact same orange right back onto it? Well, in reality, I probably wouldn't have done it this way. I would have left those as whole pointy oranges and then only sewed tips onto these. But the reason I did it this way is so you can see how you would want to do it if you wanted this square in the middle to be a different color than everything else. So you can change this up, obviously. It's improv, so you can change it up, but this is the method if you wanted to get it like this, but it also works if you need the square the same color in the middle. Okay, so what do we do next? Now we're going to sew these 2 together, and then we're going to sew these 2 together, and then we'll sew those halves together. So let's start on this side, just because they're closer to me, and I want to cut a straight edge, which I will do like that, and then I'm going to cut a straight edge here, and there we go. Now, if you want to make sure that this looks square as possible in the middle, whenever you put these together, try to line up those seam allowances right there. Okay, I have sewn these together, and as you can see, there's a good bit of bulk here because of the way that I pressed these seams before, because I pressed up towards the small ones before. So probably what I'm going to do here is I'm going to press this with my fingers, and then I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to press these open. All right, and then I'm going to come in here with my little seam roller and roll it, and then I'm going to hit that with an iron to flatten it out. I still have some bulk here, but at least it's not all on one side or the other. It's more evenly distributed around. And now I'm going to do the same thing on this side. And now we need to sew these two halves together. So I'm going to come in here with my ruler this time, and I'm deciding how much to cut off. And I'm just going to go from that point to that point, and that's what I'll cut off. And then I'll do the same thing on the other side. This is looking actually pretty precise, even though I didn't try to do it that way. So I'm going to go sew that now. There we go. And just like before, it's going to be pretty bulky if we try to push this to one side. So I'm just going to open this, and then I'm going to flip it over and pry it all open with my fingers. And then I'm going to get my seam roller, and then I'm going to take it to the ironing board to make it nice and flat. And there we go, a bow tie block that looks like this, but we did it all improv. And you'll notice it is a little pointier out here on this side and on this side. So this little triangle was slightly smaller than the others. So it looks a little wonky, but I kind of like that, don't you? And it still looks like a bow tie in the big scheme of things. So let's take a look though. If you wanted to get this instead, these points at the top would have needed to be a different color entirely from all the other ones. So let's say you put white here, and then each of these would be a different color going around. So that's the way you would get this. It's exactly the same process, but you just pick different fabrics. So as usual, I would come in here and trim things up. You can do it with a ruler, without a ruler, with a particular size in mind, or not. And then you end up with something like that, which is pretty nifty. So look at all these lovely blocks that we made today, and they are all squares in squares. So there's obviously lots of ways that you can do squares in squares, even well beyond what I have done here. But I hope this gives you some great ideas and that you'll go out and play with this, because this can add a lot of excitement to your improv compositions. I'll see you again next time for another episode of the Quilty Life with me, Jenn George Burt.